Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman, in tonight for Richard French. Just 3 hours from now, President Trump will meet with Kim Jong-un. Two world leaders, two translators, nobody else in the room. It'll be the first time the leaders of U.S. and North Korea will meet. More now from Serena Marshall, live in Washington. Good evening.
Good evening. It's a relationship that began with name-calling and threats of fire and fury, but the president up this morning in Singapore tweeting, "We will know soon whether or not a real deal, unlike those of the past, can happen." That face-to-face summit scheduled in just a few hours. A late-night stroll through Singapore. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un posing for selfies as he explored the city hosting the summit he and President Trump hope can lead to peace.
It's a one-time shot.
Even as President Trump says it's likely just the first step, he's publicly stated that he'll know the outcome within minutes of their intimate one-on-one sit-down.
Within the first minute, I'll know.
How?
My touch, my feel. That's what I do.
The administration maintains they won't settle for anything less than full denuclearization. And while the Secretary of State expects something to be signed following their meeting, there's more hard work ahead.
We are going to ensure that we set up a system sufficiently robust that we're able to verify these outcomes.
Kim hoping for a phased-out approach, but this tenuous step after years of provocation. Since taking power in 2011, Kim has tested more missiles than his father and grandfather combined, including one that could reach as far as New York or Washington. And North Korea's threat to target the U.S. had President Trump threatening to respond with fire and fury. Failure in the talks could mean North Korea ramps up their nuclear program. But the global recognition from this meeting, a big win for him back home.
The spigot has turned on for greater international engagement, economic, political, otherwise, that boost Kim's legitimacy.
The only other American to meet with the reclusive leader face-to-face, also arriving in Singapore.
I guess the bigger thing is to worry about them, though. Seeing me right now. Thank you.
The one-on-one between the leaders is officially scheduled to begin at 9 p.m. Eastern. They plan to meet on an island called Sentosa, which means peace. Live in Washington, Serena Marshall, ABC News. Now back to you.
All right, Serena, thank you very much. Lots to dissect and digest in this summit. Earlier today, I spoke with Michael O'Hanlon from Brookings. He gave us some of that insight into the North Korea summit. Michael, let's start with some perspective. How important and how historic is this summit, and what are the chances it leads to either substantive developments or at least opens the door to begin headed towards those developments?
It's very historic. There's no doubt about that. Just the simple fact that an American president and a North Korean leader have never met before. So on that one, we can pretty quickly conclude that this sets a new standard. It almost is evocative in some ways at a lower scale of strategic importance of Nixon meeting Mao or of Churchill meeting Stalin. In this case, Kim is a much less central world leader, but of course he can cause huge havoc and damage with the nuclear arsenal he presents. So in that sense, the scale of and importance of the meeting are quite significant. And again, it makes me think back to those earlier periods in history when a person who had never before been accessible to the United States was all of a sudden in summitry with an American president. In terms of the prospects for success, I think it depends on your expectations. If you want complete North Korean denuclearization in the short term, the prospects are very poor. If you're happier, however, with a process that begins to eliminate their ability to keep expanding their arsenal and gives some limited inducement or relief for that process and leaves the actual elimination of their nuclear warheads that they already have for later, I think the chances are pretty good, and we'll just have to see how things go. I try not to predict too much about two world leaders who are inherently unpredictable.
Fair enough, but let's focus on the flip side then, Michael. What are the risks if things don't go well, the risks for both the U.S. and its allies as well as for President Trump?
The risks are of totally different types. The worst case scenario by far is that things fail so badly that you wind up with the kind of acrimony these two leaders had last year. You have a return to nuclear and missile testing by North Korea, a decision by the United States in some way to militarily stop that or limit that, and then we wind up on the brink of war. That's not out of the question. That's where we were, in my judgment, last year. I'm not saying the risks of war were high last year, but they were certainly higher than I would have liked, higher than comfort would have allowed, and higher than they are now. A more realistic failure is a process by which the two leaders go home with some very limited deal, and maybe North Korea cheats on it later, or in any event, it doesn't really make any headway in limiting their threat, and it doesn't even stand up very well in terms of the domestic politics in America and Korea, And next thing you know, we're back on a more gradual path to the kind of acrimony I just described. And meanwhile, North Korea keeps enlarging its nuclear arsenal. Let's not forget, they're probably enlarging it as we speak. They have not stopped spinning their centrifuges or reprocessing their plutonium. They've simply stopped doing nuclear tests for the moment. So that's another kind of failure, a bad deal. And then one more variant would be a deal in which President Trump does achieve a fair amount of disarmament or denuclearization, but he pays what might be too high a price. For example, a complete end to the U.S.-South Korea alliance, even while North Korea still poses other kinds of threats to South Korea, even while China is a potential longer-term threat to our Korean allies. And I wouldn't be happy about that kind of an outcome either.
Two unusual developments or process issues, and I want to get your sense of them. One is that Trump and Kim Jong-un will be talking one-on-one with only translators at first. And also, President Trump said he would know within the first minute whether Kim is serious. And he also said he didn't do any prep for this, or at least no specific prep. I'm curious what you make of those comments and how we expect to see them play out.
First of all, I see a lot of that in the same general realm of not stuff for, analytical East Coast intellectuals like you and me to try to interpret and dissect every word the way we would for most presidents. Trump likes to make a splash. He likes to actually be a contrarian. He likes to say things he knows people like you and I aren't going to like. That's part of how he does business. So he'll say things that sound shocking, like I didn't prepare for the summit. Come on, he's been talking about the summit every day with the media, with his advisors. In some sense, he's definitely prepared. Whether he's prepared well enough, we'll find out. But when he says, I'm not really preparing, that's partly a way of just saying, stop pestering me. I'll be ready in my own way, on my own terms. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about it in advance. That's how I interpret that sort of a comment. And the other is sort of the same kind of vein. How can you really know what a guy's like after 60 seconds? I guess what he means is that he'll have some sense about whether Kim is there to, move into a conversation. I would think it might take 10 minutes more than 1 minute. But I suppose after 10 minutes, you can start to see if the guy's got some specific proposals that he wants to launch into discussing, or if he's just there for a photo op. So if that's what President Trump means, then I see his point. And again, I don't take the 60 seconds part too literally. I think what he's really saying is, I'll know pretty quickly if we're starting to have a serious conversation.
In the ramp-up to the summit, we heard from both Mike Pence and John Bolton about Libya serving as an example for North Korea. Isn't Libya a cautionary tale for Kim Jong-un? I mean, Gaddafi disarmed, got rid of his nukes, and a few years later he was out of office. Is that something that the U.S. has to avoid in trying to deal with North Korea?
A few years later, he was dead. He wasn't just out of office, and it was a military campaign that we contributed to supporting. So your point is even more apropos, just to back you up with the way you asked the question. I think that the Libya model is not a realistic prospect. And in fact, the reason why I was sort of, in a strange way, happy to see that brouhaha 2 or 3 weeks ago was I thought it allowed people to reset their expectations. There were some people on the U.S. side, like John Bolton, who were aspiring to a Libya model, a complete and immediate North Korean denuclearization. I don't think that was ever in the cards, and it was better that we find out early on rather than have that disagreement or that misperception on the two sides lead to a complete catastrophic failure of the summit itself. So resetting expectations, I think, was partially achieved when Bolton and Vice President Pence talked about the Libya model in the way they did. Then we had big North Korean pushback. Then President Trump canceled the summit, but sort of gave an olive branch if the North Koreans wanted to come back, which they did, and now we're back on again. I think, again, that was sort of a necessary corrective to where some of the expectations had built up in the previous weeks.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see what comes out of Singapore, both officially and then what we hear afterwards in the reporting. Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow in Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. As always, Michael, thank you.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, more analysis of the Korea summit, plus President Trump managed to alienate most of our allies, including the host country Canada, the G7 summit over the weekend. We'll look at the fallout with our panel next.